I want to talk to you today about inequality and educational opportunity in America and a little bit about it in Evanston as well. When I was 22, after I graduated from college, I went and taught high school for 2 years on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, which was then and still is today the poorest county in the United States. And it was, for a white kid from the suburbs of Cincinnati, a really different world and really interesting and challenging on a personal level, and I really loved it. And after I left there, I went and taught for 2 years in Morristown, New Jersey, which is an affluent suburb in South Jersey, and almost as far away in America, socioeconomically, culturally, historically, as you can get from a place like Pine Ridge. Also an interesting place, and I really enjoyed teaching there, but I spent a lot of time as a young man thinking about the sort of two Americas, the extremely different sets of opportunities that young people had growing up in those communities because of what was in their communities, the quality of their schools, and the general opportunities available to them. So I went to graduate school to study those things, and I've essentially been thinking about them and doing research on them for the last 20 years. And so today I'm going to talk about some of that research, and I'm going to give a little bit of historical context for the conversation around education and opportunity, and then talk about what that looks like in America today and what it looks like in Evanston today. But I should say I don't know a lot about Evanston. Lonnie made it sound like I don't know anything about anything, but I know a lot about things from a sort of 30,000-foot level, as you'll see, and I think that helps illuminate a set of patterns and that are important to understand. But what I particularly enjoyed today in meeting with folks this afternoon was learning a lot more about the kind of on-the-ground context and those sorts of things. So this is a picture of academic achievement gaps in the United States over the last 50 or so years. The white line represents the achievement gap between high and low-income students. The black and the orange lines represent the gaps between white and black and white and Hispanic students. And I put this picture together by using data from 50 years of national studies. And I think it tells, in some ways, the story of inequality in America in the second half of the 20th century. In the 1950s and 60s, we were in a period of historically low economic inequality and a period of high and persistent racial inequality. And those inequalities were reflected in large differences in children's opportunities to learn and therefore reflected in achievement gaps. But we actually made a lot of progress on the racial disparities during the civil rights movement and in the decade that followed, both because we desegregated schools, but also because we desegregated housing. We improved early childhood education through Head Start. We desegregated hospitals, so African Americans had better health care. A lot of things made opportunities more equal, though as you can see, they're still far from equal. Those achievement gaps, they're measured here in sort of grade levels, so the black-white achievement gap today is still about 2 grade levels on average. The Hispanic-white gap is about the same, but that's down from 3 or 4 grade levels 50 years ago. So that we should celebrate that as progress, but the work isn't done. The achievement gap between high and low-income students, on the other hand, has gone the opposite direction. It was low in the 50s and 60s, and then grew fairly rapidly from the mid-1970s through 2000 or so. And part of the reason for that is the confluence of a couple trends. One is rising economic inequality. So this is a picture of income inequality in the United States, put together by Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez. And this represents the proportion of all income earned in the United States by the top 10% of earners in the United States. So back in the 1930s and 1920s, the top earners earned 45% of all income in the United States. That dropped precipitously at the start of World War II as the economy was restructured. And it remained historically low at about 33% for 4 decades. But starting in the late 70s, economic inequality in the United States began to grow again for a variety of reasons, and is now higher than any point in the last century. So the top 10% of earners in the United States now earn almost 50% of the income in the United States. And that growth in inequality meant that children were growing up, poor children and rich children and rich families were growing up in really different kinds of households with really different sets of resources, much different than they had been in the 1950s and 1960s. And one consequence of that was that high and low income families increasingly diverged in how much they were able to invest in their children. So this is data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which is a national survey that surveys people and asks them what they spend their money on. And the bottom line represents the average spending of families in the bottom quintile of the income distribution, and the red line, families at the top. And it's important to note that families of all income levels have increased their investments in their children. The low-income families' average investment has gone up from $800 to $1,300, about a 50% increase. But high-income families have increased their spending by about 150%, from $3,500 to over almost $9,000. So the disparity in the amount of financial investment in young children has grown over that same time period. If you look at data on how much time families spend with their children, you see the same pattern. Everyone says they spend more time now with their children than they did 40 years ago, but that increase is greatest among higher income and more highly educated folks, mostly because they have more time to do that. With the changes in the economy mean that low-income workers have to work more hours even to earn the relatively little that they do earn. So we've seen a sort of growing disparity in how much families have in terms of resources and in how much they are able then to invest in their children, which then is reflected in their educational outcomes. And we also have had a big increase in economic segregation. So this is a picture that shows the degree of economic segregation in the United States over the last 50 years. The red boxes are the proportion of all families that live in poor neighborhoods, that is, neighborhoods that have median income that's well below their regional average, and the blue boxes are proportions of families who live in high-income neighborhoods. And in 1970, about 1 in 6 families lived in either a really affluent or a really poor neighborhood, and today it's 33% of all families live in either a really poor or a really rich neighborhood. And far fewer families live in a kind of middle-income, mixed-income neighborhood. And that polarization is particularly pronounced among families with school-age children. In fact, almost all of this pattern is driven by the increasing residential segregation of families with kids of school age. And those families are increasingly sorting themselves into different communities if they can afford to do so. And so that leaves our school districts increasingly segregated by income. So the rise in economic inequality doesn't just mean that rich and poor children have different amounts of resources at home, but because it leads to economic segregation, it means that rich and poor children grow up in really different kinds of neighborhoods as well, and that has consequences for the kinds of opportunities they have. So some of this long-term story is also driven by the fact that if you grew up in the if you were born in the 1930s and had children in the 1950s or 60s, at the time you were having kids, you were way better off than your parents were, because the economy had grown very rapidly for 20 years after the war. And you didn't need at that time in the 1960s to have a college degree to make a middle-class wage, to buy a house in the suburbs and sort of live the American dream. And so in the 1960s, education wasn't seen as central to upward mobility. It was important, but it wasn't the only way to sort of move up. But after the economy sort of changes in the 1970s, people start to get much more anxious about education. You need a college degree to get a good job. And by the 1980s, it's not clear that your children are going to be better off than you were. It was clear for kids born in the 60s, but it's not clear for kids born in the 80s. And so parents of all economic backgrounds start to get, I think, increasingly anxious about their children's chances of upward mobility, and therefore start to get more invested in in their children's education. And that's part of why we see this increasing segregation for families with school-age kids and increasing investments in early childhood. So think of this as a sort of a long story of the confluence of rising economic inequality, the increasing importance of education, the increasing anxiety of parents about their children's success, all leading to sort of greater disparities in how much families can invest in their children's educational opportunities, either by purchasing a home in a desirable school district, investing in other kinds of resources for their kids. So that's all sort of backdrop to sort of where we are today, where by and large folks think education is central to children's future economic success. And so families that have the means to invest a lot on average in their children's education. So what does that mean for the families that don't have a lot of resources? And that's part of what I want to talk about today. So before I go further, I want to say something about test scores, because I showed you these achievement gaps, and I'm going to talk a lot about test scores. So I'm going to show you average test scores for every school district in the United States, and for Evanston in particular, and it's important to think about what those mean. So test scores are not measures of school quality, and when you look at average test scores, they're not measures of average intelligence. That is, on average, people who live in one place or live in another place don't have differences in sort of innate intelligence, so they don't measure that. And they're also not the only thing we care about when we're thinking about children's educational success. I mean, as I'm sure you know, any parent wants their child to grow up to be a lot of things, and good at tests is maybe not at the top of the list, but happy, creative, empathetic, social, collaborative, all of those things might be higher on the list than good at tests. But that's not to say that test scores in the aggregate can't be thought of as useful measures of opportunity. And so if you look at the average test scores in a particular place, that can give you some sense of the level of educational opportunity that children growing up in that community have had. But that's not just due to schools. That's due to all the kinds of opportunities children have had to learn from the time they're born until they finish school. That is, opportunities in their home, opportunities in their neighborhoods, in their childcare, in their preschool programs, after-school programs, and in their public schools. But so when I'm talking about test scores here, I want you to think opportunity. Think of them as measures of opportunity. Don't think of them as assessments of school quality or innate intelligence or anything like that. So what I've been doing for the last few years is collecting every standardized test score that every child in public school in the United States has taken for the last 7 years. I've gone around, I've knocked on school doors, and collected 300 million test scores. We test children a lot in the United States, it turns out, and we have a lot of children. So under No Child Left Behind, and now under the successor law, ESSA, to No Child Left Behind, every public school is required to test every child in 3rd through 8th grade in math and English language arts, and test them as well in high school. So what I'm going to show you today is based on those tests given by states under No Child Left Behind in every public school in the United States from 2009 to 2013. We have more recent data, but we haven't finished cleaning it up, so I'm just going to show you 5 years of data, and it's only 215 million test scores that I can show you tonight, but the rest will come soon. So what we can do with that is we can look at the patterns of educational outcomes and therefore educational opportunity at a very fine grain, very high resolution. And this map shows you the average test scores, and again, think opportunity, in every school district in the United States. The dark green parts are school districts whose average test scores are 2.5 grade levels above the national average, and the dark purple are school districts whose average test scores are 2.5 grade levels below the national average. These are averaged over the 5 years of data over grades 3 through 8 and averaged over math and reading scores, just to make it simpler, so I didn't have to show you 60 different pictures, but just one. And we've done a lot of work, as you may know. Every state gives its own test, and those tests differ across grades. and sometimes they change from year to year. So we've done a lot of work to harmonize those data and to put them all onto a common scale. And so these are put onto a scale that allows us to compare across states and grades and time and so on. So you can see some broad patterns there. Low educational opportunity in many parts of the Deep South and many parts of the West. Higher opportunity in many of the regions surrounding large cities, the suburban regions and large parts of New England. You can see Pine Ridge, where I taught, right there, which has among the lowest average test scores in the country. That's, I'm sure, not because of my teaching. If we zoom in a little bit, you can see a little bit closer, and you might be interested in Chicago, which has below average test scores, so I'll show you more interesting information about that later. And we're right now up in one of those green areas right up there, but more on that later. So the map is interesting, but more interesting, I think, is to look at the relationship between educational opportunity and the characteristics of communities. What kinds of communities have high educational opportunity, and what kinds of places do children have more chances to learn? So what we did was we took 11,500 school districts for which we have data, and we've plotted them here in relationship to the socioeconomic conditions of the school district. So the horizontal axis here is a measure of the average socioeconomic conditions of the families who have children in the public schools in each of those districts. So that's sort of a measure of the median income in the community, the percent of parents who have a bachelor's degree, the unemployment rate, the SNAP eligibility rate, the poverty rate, and the single-parent household rate. And we construct this composite so that we can compare every school district to each other on the socioeconomic measure. And then the vertical axis is this measure of average achievement measured in grade level differences from the national average. So 0 here means you're at the national average. And so higher means above average. So you can see an obvious pattern here in that opportunity is higher in more advantaged places and lower in less advantaged places. Now, what's not clear from this is to what extent is that difference in educational opportunity the result of differences in opportunities children get at home, differences in the opportunities they get in early childhood, or differences in the quality of the schools that they attend. And while that correlation is really strong, there's still a lot of variability if you just look at places of a single socioeconomic condition. So if we look at the 100 largest school districts in the United States, highlighted here, you can see that even among very large districts that are relatively similar in some cases in their socioeconomic conditions, there's real differences in opportunity. So the big one here is New York. The one below it is Los Angeles, and this one here is Chicago. So New York and Los Angeles have relatively similar socioeconomic conditions. The children in both school districts come from families that are, on average, poorer and somewhat less, have less educational attainment than the national average, but they're not extremely poor places. But there's a grade level difference in the average achievement between New York and Los Angeles. And so that says that there's something more than socioeconomic background that matters. Something in New York that creates more opportunity for children of the same economic background as children in Los Angeles. We're trying to sort of see if we can dig into that and learn what it is. There's also a lot of variation across states. So I highlighted here the school districts in Massachusetts in red and the school districts in California in white. And one of the striking things here is we know Massachusetts always sort of scores high on NAEP and national assessments like that. But what's striking is that even the poor school districts in Massachusetts, places like Lawrence and Lowell and Boston and Holyoke, have higher average performance than school districts that are equally disadvantaged around the country. And so it's not, the Massachusetts phenomenon is not because there's a lot of affluent school districts and highly educated folks. Certainly those places up here, students are doing quite well and have lots of opportunities, but something good is happening in the Bostons and the Lawrences and the Lowells of Massachusetts as well. particularly when you compare it to California, where middle class and low income school districts have relatively low performance, low opportunity for their children. Some of that is due to the fact that California doesn't fund its public schools very well. Some of it is probably due to the fact that Massachusetts has a very coherent and long-standing kind of focus on the curriculum and the standards in the state. They invest more in preschool than most other states and so on. Some people ask me if the California scores are low because they have a lot of English learners. It's a plausible question, but when you look at Texas, now in red, Texas has equal composition in terms of English learners and socioeconomic conditions as California, but on average test scores are substantially higher in Texas than California. So we can't let California off the hook just because it has a large proportion of English learner students. Let's look at Illinois, since we're here. So Illinois, if we look at all the school districts in Illinois in white, the big one is obviously Chicago. Illinois is kind of middle of the road. It's sort of typical of the nation. That is, Chicago test scores, opportunity to learn in Chicago is roughly comparable to school districts of the same socioeconomic conditions around the country. And that's true sort of across the economic spectrum. So where is Evanston? That's what you're all wondering, right? So Evanston is right there. And when I say Evanston, I'm talking about School District 65, because remember, these test score data come from grades 3 through 8. So I don't have any data here on the high school district. So Chicago is sort of relatively poor, but not terribly poor. Evanston is relatively affluent, but not the highest. Evanston is at about the 84th percentile of the socioeconomic distribution of districts around the country. That is, 16% of districts in the country are more socioeconomically advantaged than Evanston, 84% are less. But Evanston has higher average test scores than you would predict based on its socioeconomic conditions. In fact, its test scores are at about the 94th percentile of the national distribution. So only about 6% of districts nationwide have average test scores higher than Evanston. So that says Evanston's relatively affluent, not Winnetka affluent, I guess, right? But its performance is much higher than you might predict, even given its relative socioeconomic conditions. You want to know that's Winnetka and Wilmette right there. So they're at about the 99th percentile of socioeconomic conditions nationwide, and I think around the 97th or 98th, probably 98th percentile of school district performance. Not that we're comparing. Just saying. All right, so moving on. So let me go a little bit further into the data and tell you what's sort of underneath those pictures. So this is more like what the underlying data look like. So if you looked at what third graders' scores were, and fourth grader score, and fifth grader, and sixth grader. If you look at them nationwide, they'll look like this. That is, the average third grader has scores at, shockingly, the third grade level. And the average eighth grader is at the eighth grade level, because we're defining third through eighth grade as just the national average for that grade level. So this line just represents the national average. This is average test scores in Chicago. So in third grade in Chicago, on average, students score about a grade and a half level below the national average. By eighth grade, students in Chicago score only about a half grade level behind the national average. That is, average test scores go up by 6 grade levels during the 5 years from third to eighth grade. So students in Chicago make faster progress from third to eighth grade than the average nationwide. If we looked at Evanston, we would see this. On average, in third grade, students in Evanston score a little above the fourth grade level, and by eighth grade, they score close to the 10th grade level. So they also make faster than average progress, but start from a higher place. But one thing this should suggest to you is that even in third grade, the kind of higher performance of Evanston is evident, and while they make some additional progress beyond them, much of that is already there. So one of the ways we can measure what's going on is we can look at the slope of that line. So if it's steeper than average, that says the growth is higher than average. And so that may be a more useful way of thinking about getting a handle on sort of what's happening during the school years than just looking at the levels of performance. And so if we make the same map, but now map the growth rates from 3rd to 8th grade, you see something that's rather different. This map is, I think the technical term is it's more checkerboardy than the other one. That is, there's not the same sort of pattern. Many parts of the West now are green, not purple. Many suburban areas, if you sort of zoom in, are not so green. And in fact, Chicago now is dark green on that map. That is, it has quite high growth rates relative to the national average. And some of the surrounding suburban places there or in other areas aren't as dark green as they were. So knowing about levels doesn't really tell you whether there's growth rates during the school year. So we wanted to see, well, is it true that more advantaged communities have higher growth rates? Are they able to add more opportunity during the elementary and middle school years? So if we make the plot now, again, we've got the socioeconomic status on the horizontal axis, and we make the plot on the vertical axis of growth rates instead of levels. So a growth rate of 1 is average. That means you grow 1 grade level per grade. Sounds silly when I say it, but that's what you do. There's still a bit of a correlation here that on average, the more advantaged communities have higher growth rates, but it's not nearly so pronounced as when you look at the levels, which is to say there's many high-income places that don't have particularly fast growth rates. Some even have slower than average growth rates. And there's a lot of low-income places up in the upper left that are poor but still have growth rates that are faster than average. If we look at the Illinois school districts again, we see this pattern. So there's Chicago, and you can see Chicago is kind of striking. Chicago is an outlier in its growth rate. That is, has very rapid growth relative to most other school districts, faster than most affluent school districts, faster than any other large school district in the country. I was actually suspicious of this. So I looked at other data, not our data, and you see exactly the same thing in other data. So I think that's real, and I think we've been talking to people in Chicago to try to see if we can understand what to attribute that to and what can other large districts learn from it. But many of the other districts have growth rates that are, around the national average, some a little higher, some a little lower, but the affluent districts aren't particularly pronounced in their growth rates. So that suggests a lot of the differences in educational outcomes between high and low income districts isn't because of faster growth rate during the elementary and middle school years, but because of big differences that are already there in 3rd grade. So a lot of the inequality is being produced prior to 3rd grade, and little of it is evident. Little of it is it's not being increased much after 3rd grade. Evanston is here. It's a little bit above average in terms of growth rate. As you saw, the growth rate was faster than average in that earlier slide, but not as fast as Chicago. But we're not comparing, remember? So now I want to talk more about differences in opportunity by race and by social class, both nationally and also in Evanston. So we can look not just at the average test scores in every district, but we can break them down and look at the test scores of students of different racial or ethnic backgrounds, as well as students who are eligible for free lunch or not eligible for free lunch. And if we look at the free lunch, not free lunch data, so the yellow dots here are the average test scores of low-income students eligible for free or reduced lunch, and the red dots are the test scores of students who are not eligible, so poor versus non-poor. You can see a big difference in the same district. So these districts are on top of each other, same district. The difference is on average about 2 grade levels. So So low-income students are scoring on average about 2 grade levels behind high-income students, though there's a lot of variability around that. There are some districts, obviously, where the low-income students are doing much better and some where they're doing much worse, and so on. If you look at the growth rates, they're not very different. So this is now our measure of growth rate on the vertical axis, and you can see the red and the yellow dots kind of overlap. There's a little bit of difference, but for the most part, poor and non-poor students have the same average growth rates of test scores from 3rd to 8th grade, so the differences in test scores between poor and non-poor students are largely present in 3rd grade and don't change a whole lot from 3rd to 8th grade. So both that and the earlier point suggest that much of the action that produces economic inequality and opportunity is things that's happening before 3rd grade, maybe in early childhood and preschool and in the early elementary years. So we can look in more detail at Evanston now. So in Evanston, if we look at the average test scores of poor students in Evanston, those who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch, you can see that in 3rd grade, they're about a grade level below the national average. Now, remember, this is the national average for all students, not the national average for poor students. And they catch up almost by 8th grade to the national average. They're a little less than a half grade level behind by 8th grade. The non-poor students in Evanston start out in 3rd grade more than 3 grade levels above the national average and 4 grade levels above the low-income students in Evanston. So let me say that again, because it's a big number. The difference in average test scores in 3rd grade between poor and non-poor students in Evanston is about 4 grade levels difference. By the time you get to 8th grade, it's about 4 grade levels difference. It does not change appreciably during that time period. So that achievement gap, that opportunity gap is produced earlier than 3rd grade. It doesn't widen during the school years, but it doesn't narrow appreciably either. Now, this is not a pattern that's unique to Evanston in some ways. That is, in most places we look, the achievement gaps are about the same size in 8th grade as they are in 3rd grade. Most of the action in these kind of achievement gaps is before 3rd grade. That's not to say schools might not do more to reduce them after 3rd grade, but whatever is sort of the primary cause of them is not the experiences kids are having 3rd grade on. So we'll come back to talk a little bit about that. So this is just showing where Evanston students fall compared to other districts. So this is the performance of poor students in Chicago and Evanston. You can't really see that, but that's the Evanston dot there in Chicago. They're both right on the line. That is, they're both average. So for school districts like them, the low-income students in Evanston and Chicago perform at the average of school districts like them. Not better, not worse. But for the non-poor students in Evanston, and in Chicago for that matter, score much better than non-poor students in similar districts like them. So in Evanston, the non-poor students score 2 grade levels higher than students like them in districts like Evanston score around the country. Evanston's an enormous outlier here in terms of the performance of the higher income students. In fact, it's at the 99th percentile. That is, there's only about 10 or 15 school districts in the country where non-poor students score better on average than Evanston. You guys are doing a great job with students who aren't poor, right? No, I mean, I think that actually suggests there's lots of resources in a community like Evanston to provide educational opportunity, and in Chicago as well. So both of them are outliers, and trying to figure out then how to use the kind of resources that are available to the non-poor students to benefit poor students is the kind of challenge that a community like Evanston, I think, faces, and those are hard things. So I want to then look at the racial achievement gaps. So if we look at Evanston, again, we can look at the grade-specific data. So in Evanston, black students score a little bit below the national average in 3rd grade, and a little bit below the national average in 8th grade. Not much of a difference. Now, I should say the black students' average test scores in Evanston place Evanston at about the 78th percentile if you measure districts by the performance of their black students. That is, about 22% of districts have average test scores of their black students that are higher than the average test scores of black students in Evanston. So while the black test scores are below the national average of all students, they're above the national average for black students, and Evanston is about the 78th percentile. So that's good, that's 78th percentile, right? For Hispanic students in Evanston, the Hispanic students in 3rd grade are actually a little bit lower performing than black students, but they're actually outperforming them substantially by 8th grade. So Hispanic students are making much more progress than the national average in Evanston or than black students. White students score very high in Evanston. So the average 3rd grader in Evanston is scoring at about the 7th grade level nationally, and the average 8th grader is scoring at about the 12th grade level, though the scale doesn't really work at that point, but the gap is the same size. So there's about a 4 grade level difference. Well, actually about a 4.5 grade level difference between whites and black students in Evanston. So where does Evanston fall? Where do Evanston white students fall in the national distribution? So we have about 11,500 school districts whose data we look at. Evanston's white students' average test scores place them at number 1. There is no school district in the country, not Winnetka and Wilmette. There is no school district in the country where white students on average score higher than they do in Evanston, out of 11,500 school districts. So that's remarkable, particularly given that Evanston's at the 84th percentile of the socioeconomic distribution. So there's a lot of resources and a lot being marshaled to provide opportunities for white students and for non-poor students in Evanston, as evidenced by the really high performance of them relative to other communities like them. The same is not true for African American students and low-income students in Evanston. They're not failing, the test scores aren't terrible, they're well above what you would predict in some ways, but they are still well below the level at which the test scores of white and affluent students are. And so, you know, we had a really interesting conversation this afternoon about that, and I hope to hear some of your thoughts later on about that. But I think it raises a set of questions about how opportunity gets structured within a community. So some of the data I showed you is about differences between communities, and things like residential segregation and economic inequality explain some of that. But within a community, then I think we have to think hard about what are the forces that create that kind of inequality, and are there ways to provide the same kinds of opportunities for the African American students, the Hispanic students, and the low-income students in a place that's as successful. It's clear there are very good schools here. But it's also clear these gaps are already there in 3rd grade. They're not getting appreciably smaller over 3rd to 8th grade, but something is happening that's creating really different opportunities prior to that point in time. And I think as a society, not just in Evanston, but as a larger society, since this is sort of the same story that you see nationally writ large, we have to sort of think about how to do that. If you look at the scores now compared to other districts around the country, so here's Chicago and Evanston, black students, they're comparable to districts like them around the country. For Hispanic students, Chicago is comparable to districts around the country, but Evanston's Hispanic students actually do better than they do in districts around the country. But the white students, as you can see, are at the very top. And that's, I think, that's the challenge. So when we put some of this data out publicly last year, and the New York Times reported on it, and you might have seen some of these graphs, and you could sort of click on them. And it was reported there that Evanston had one of the largest achievement gaps in the country, and that's true, but it's a large achievement gap not because the black students are failing, but because the white and the affluent students are are being enriched by so much opportunity, right? So this seems to me the kind of community, I don't know, it's dangerous to come to a community and tell people what kind of community they are, but this seems to me the kind of community in the data that has the kind of resources to solve the problem in ways that other communities that have large achievement gaps might not have the same kind of resources to do so. And so I think that poses a challenge to our notion of what we think of as equity and fairness and opportunity and the American dream. So I want to show you a few more things and then open up to conversation. So why are there large achievement gaps in some school districts like Evanston? And so one reason is there's socioeconomic disparities. So white and black families nationwide, white income is about 60%, black income is about 60% of white income. Black parents have lower average educational attainment levels than white parents. And those things mean that there's different set of material resources that families can provide their kids. They can afford different kinds of neighborhoods and different school systems, different kinds of preschool and so on. And those things matter, certainly, just, and you can see here that that's the case. Places where the white-black difference in socioeconomic status is largest tend to have larger achievement gaps. So this is the achievement gap now on the vertical axis. But even in places where socioeconomic disparities are zero, so even over here, these are communities where whites and blacks have the same levels of income, same levels of education. You still see a sizable achievement gap. And that says, I think, that American society is still structured in ways that create unequal opportunity by race, even net of socioeconomic background. That is, socioeconomic differences are not sufficient to explain racial disparities. And there are many, many possible factors that go into that, and most of which have some validity. So levels of segregation, discrimination, unequal expectations or treatment in schools, stereotype threat. There's a lot of ways to explain this that aren't dependent on socioeconomic differences. But writ large, I think what they say is that we need to think both about race and class in American society. Race is not reducible to a problem of class differences at this stage in American history. Certainly, the class differences matter. Things would be more equal, I think, if we had more equal economic and socioeconomic conditions for blacks and whites or Hispanics and whites. I don't have the Hispanic white picture, but if you look at the Hispanic white data, the picture's exactly the same as this. Now, the places that have the biggest achievement gaps in the country are two kinds of places. So one is large urban school districts, Atlanta, Washington, Oakland, Minneapolis, that have very affluent, highly educated white populations and relatively poor African-American populations. So you have big socioeconomic difference. That's why they're off on the left side of the picture. And a correspondingly large achievement gap, a large difference in the kinds of opportunities that children in those communities have, partly because those places are very segregated, and partly because families don't have the same material resources that they can provide their children. But the other set of places here that have large achievement gaps are Evanston, but Berkeley, Chapel Hill, Madison, Wisconsin, the kind of places that a person like me will spend the rest of my life probably, right? And Evanston is particularly striking here in that Evanston has a much smaller socioeconomic disparity, black-white socioeconomic disparity, than most of those other places, but it has a very large gap. And so it is relatively unique in that picture. The places like it, Berkeley, Chapel Hill, Madison, are similar, I think, in a number of dimensions, but have more racial socioeconomic inequality than Evanston. And so trying to understand what it is that we can do in those kinds of places, which are highly resourced, highly educated places, typically relatively socially liberal, where folks care about equity. Evanston has been part of the network focused on minority achievement gaps since its founding, and as I understand it, been a long history of attention to the issue. So it's not for lack of resources and lack of interest. But I think these are hard problems to solve, but we need to. The other thing I would say, the other large cause of racial achievement gaps is segregation. So the horizontal axis here is a measure of segregation, how socioeconomically different the schools of white and black students are. And you can see when segregation is low, achievement gaps tend to be lower, and when segregation is high, achievement gaps are higher in ways that correspond to our understanding of what segregation does. But the Berkeley, Chapel Hill, Evanston, Madison, those places are not highly segregated. The schools are not highly segregated. They're black and white, Hispanic students in those places tend to go to schools with relatively similar racial ethnic compositions, relatively similar socioeconomic compositions. So segregation is not the explanation in those places. It is part of the story in Atlanta, Washington, and places like that. And when we look at the achievement gap between poor and non-poor students, again, segregation is a key part of the story. Here, this is segregation between poor and non-poor students, and you can see as that gets larger, the achievement gap gets larger. But again, Madison, Evanston, Berkeley are not highly segregated on this dimension. That's not why they have large achievement gaps. It's part of why those other places do. So, what does this all mean? Well, I think it tells us a couple things. One is we have an enormous amount of educational inequality in the United States, driven largely by differences in the kind of opportunities that children have in their early childhood and in their early elementary schools. That is, in most places, those opportunity gaps are evident in third grade or earlier when we have earlier data to look at. And in most places, school systems aren't able to undo that. There are school systems where achievement gaps get smaller over time, but the magnitude of the disparities when kids get into school or in third grade is bigger in most places than school systems alone seem to be able to undo. So that says if we want to reduce educational inequality and increase educational opportunity, we need to think about strategies that involve whole communities, not just the school system, and that need to think about early childhood opportunities, quality of neighborhood environments, supports for families with children to make sure they can be the best parents, for the best, first teacher for their children. And we need to think then about how school systems can sort of integrate with those other community organizations so that there's a kind of a wraparound focus on equity. And one of the things that I think fights against this is that as inequality grows, and inequality is very high now, and parents understand the importance of education, there's a way in which if we think of education as a private good, it's a thing you can buy for your child, then the people with more resources will always find a way to buy more of it. But if you think of education as a public good, a collective good, as part of what a functioning democratic society requires, we want people to be able to collaborate, to be empathetic, to understand different points of view, to disagree respectfully, to work together creatively. If we want that, then you start to think about education as a collective good and not something you can buy for your child alone, but something that we have to buy and invest in collectively as a society or as communities. If you think of it that way, then it starts to become less a zero-sum game where I need my child to be in the gifted program, and that may mean your child can't be, or I need my child to get these resources, but there aren't enough to go around. If we think of it as a collective good, I think there's a way to get around the problem that unequal resources invariably create, which is those that have will find ways to get more for their children. And so I get that everyone wants the best for their kid, and in a zero-sum world with large economic inequality, wanting the best for your kid leads to inequality. But in a high inequality world where you want the best for your community, I don't think that has to lead to equity. And so I think part of the challenge is figuring out how to reframe a conversation about education and opportunity to a conversation about the collective good and the collective value of investing in opportunity rather than the private value of it that might accrue to one particular child. I don't know how to do that, but I'm hoping you guys do. Because I think in some ways this is a place that could figure that out. This is a place that has evidently, all the data say really good schools. It has a community, as I saw this afternoon, with lots of leaders who are really invested in thinking about this and want to do something about it. It has lots of resources. So if not here, where is sort of what I think. If not places like this, where? And I didn't come here to tell you what to do, but I spent a lot of time thinking about Evanston as I looked at the data in preparation to come here. And Evanston is somewhat unique in that the scope of the problem, but also the potential for change, I think, given the set of resources that seem to be here. So I'll end there and take questions or comments or conversation or whatever.